Hello and welcome to CherrySTEM number 4. Is gender a social construct? Now, I'm your host, Anna Cherry, with Richard Rall, my co-host as always, and our guest today is Blair White. Say hello, Blair. Or wrestle with the mutant button that I imposed on you. Anyway, we are joined by Blair and possibly Brian Martinez later. And now, Blair, you just mentioned that you made a "Is gender a social construct" type of video. So why don't you, tell us a little bit about yourself and your relation to this topic, as well as your latest video.
Okay, so I do a number of anti-feminist related videos, and my most recent video, which is definitely appropriate for this chat, was I kind of attempted to debunk the feminist perspective that gender is a social construct, that there's no real such thing as men or women, and that we're all just kind of blank slates that become masculine or feminine through socialization. And I went over sort of the very basic differences between male and female brains and brain activity. And yeah, that was kind of what the video was.
Excellent. I would like to very much extend some of that conversation, and it's been kind of a gender-full week as the Ranzerker just recently discussed the Lacey Green and the Braincraft woman video on the brain differences between men and women, and if there such exist in gay or transgender people, and their instant, sort of reply in the first minute of this video was that, no such thing exists, and as we both know through doing research, that is not quite correct. Isn't that true?
Yeah, absolutely. The Lacey Green video really grinds my gears.
I very much, very much relate to that feeling because as neuropsychology being my, the degree that I have, therefore kind of the life path and the that I've chosen for myself. So I'm quite passionate about neuroscience and psychology, but especially in the combination of the two. And as a person who's interested in brains and basically has, a future or a career in brains, seeing this person associated with PBS's Braincraft, no less, and it has the word brain in it. And for her to say that if you cut open a brain, there will be no difference between a male and a female halves if you look at it, that it blew my mind so much that someone who's supposed to be representing, brain science could say something like that. Since we've known for at least the past 10, 15 years, in neuroscience being, a fairly new sort of field of study, we've known that there are very large, glaring rather, specific differences between male and female brains, and it's called sexual dimorphism. We've done even more research in the past 10, 15 years with MRIs and PET scans, and we looked at gay brains versus straight brains, and there's a difference there too. So it seems something that has to do with, something as powerful and over regulating over the body as hormones, that there are definitely distinct differences depending on the gender of the person. In fact, sexual dimorphism in brain size, just that alone, is common. I mean, okay, so 1 minute, 1 second, I will give credit, I suppose, where it's due for the Braincraft person mentioning that there are differences in the corpus callosum. The size of the corpus callosum does differ, but the size overall of the brain differs between men and women. The amount of gray matter to white matter ratio also differs in men and women. And here we have a abstract and a study on actually estrogen regulating brain size genes from Biomed Central. And, in the very background of the abstract, they mentioned that sexual dimorphism in brain size is common among primates, including humans, apes, and some old world monkeys. In these three species, the brain size of males is generally larger than a female's, and that's true for humans. And curiously, this dimorphism has actually persisted over the course of primate evolution and human origin. So in our, former selves, unevolved, primate cousins, they also have this difference in male and female monkey brain size and hemisphere difference as well, and that is conserved, meaning it hasn't changed through evolution. The set of genes has not been affected like other genes have. Like, for instance, monkeys, don't walk upright for the most part. Humans do. That's a set of, motor, etc. genes that has evolved. It's not been conserved. But brain size seems to have been conserved. In fact, there is information here that points out to estrogen specifically being something that those genes that are responsible for brain size, they seem to be estrogen responsive elements on those genes. So we actually have a very direct relation of the hormone estrogen, that's a female hormone, that actually maintains the brain difference that is consistent with primates and humans. So it's almost like a Mobius strip here that goes kind of against everything, the feminist perspective of gender theory, radical feminist, I suppose, because it's something that's been happening only in the third wave that kind of went along with postmodernism, where things are starting to be redefined. And they have the idea that, gender is a social construct, right? So we have evidence here that not only is gender a biological construct that's been conserved since the primate times, but estrogen, the female hormone, is actually in charge of keeping it that way. So anyway, that was just a really interesting little study that I was looking at, because in this idea that not just humans, but monkeys have a difference in how they approach things from a very early age. Like, we found that female monkeys choose toys that little girls would choose, and that male monkeys choose toys that boys would choose. And this usually happens at, a 3 to 4 month old period before any socialization could come in. But
Yeah,
as we
wasn't it
saw,
like balls and trucks for the boys and like dolls for the females? And it's just so neat that they like just walked up to piles of toys and picked out like balls and trucks when they were boys and little dolls when they're girls. It's just one of the funniest things about that.
absolutely. It's actually a Life Science article on that that will be posted in a low bar after the show ends, that has a photo of a female monkey, holding a toy, like a doll Raggedy Ann situation, and a male monkey playing with a little police truck. So it's very much that sort of thing. Of course, the common idea is that it has to do with wait, what's that? Well, we can get to that later. But I just want to kind of go back to the idea: is gender a social construct?
Yeah. Can I say something real quick about
Go ahead.
the okay, so on our video, I like to well, I prefer to believe that instead of just bold-faced lying and manipulating, that people are just ignorant. And so here's something that is from a Journal of Neuroscience article: Sex Differences in the Brain, the Not So Inconvenient Truth. And so I'm going to read a little excerpt here. It says, in 2001, the Institute of Medicine, a branch of the National Academy of Science in the USA, concluded that many aspects of both normal and pathological brain functioning exhibit important yet poorly understood sex differences. 10 years later, the National Institute of Mental Health convened a workshop titled Sex Differences in the Brain, Behavior, Mental Health, and Mental Disorders, and concluded, one, there is a paucity of research examining sex differences at a neurobiological and mechanistic level. Two, there are pervasive sex differences in the brain. And three, there is a need for more neuroscientists to incorporate sex as a variable in experimental designs. So basically, I suppose it's a possibility that they're just working off really old data, and that's why she's saying what she did, because otherwise it comes across as just crazy, not even close to the truth. If you'd spend like 5 minutes looking up sexual dimorphism, I mean, right off the bat, you can go to Wikipedia and you find, neuroscience of sex differences, and right off the bat they have a study of 949 people, and basically what it points out is that so you got the lower brain area that's like the cerebellum, that is associated with physical movement and things of that that nature, and then you have the the rest of the brain. And one of the things they found is that the ways in which they're connected, specifically interhemispheric connection, was greater in women in the I can't even pronounce it, but basically in the upper brain area, and intrahemispheric connection was greater in men, and then that was exactly reversed in the other brain area. So in other words, the brains were the interconnection, the way that it's connected, whether it's within the hemisphere or across hemispheres, is exactly the opposite between men and women. And there's nothing more categorical to the way a brain works and encodes information than the way that it's connected. That's how the information is stored, is through connection. That's one of the most basic tenets of neurobiology, neuroscience, period. And so it's just like right off the bat, you can find that in 5 minutes, that the very basis of the way that the two brains work is in opposition in a certain, from a certain perspective. So to say that there's not a real difference is just so easily debunked in such a short period of time with so little effort that I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, but it's really, really difficult. So anyhow, if you had something else that you wanted to say there, go right ahead, because I got a ton of stuff that I want to unload.
I mean, I don't think you need to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think that they are using old data, but I believe it's very much intentional, because I think the old data is consistent with their narrative. I think that it's actually harder to find that older data. I did my video, and like I've told you guys before the chat, I'm by no means an expert on neuroscience. I'm actually a huge dummy when it comes to it, but it was so incredibly easy for even me to debunk it that there's really no reason why anyone should believe the things that Lacey and the other girl were talking about in the video.
Yeah, it's hard to not just completely categorically call that video just a type of propaganda, just a complete manipulation. It's because I just can't. It's hard to see it any other way than just completely a social manipulation and for a bias, because it's just so easy to find this data, and it's so well known that there are massive differences in the way in the structure. And well, let me go over a couple of things, if that's all right, Cherry. Can I do that, or were you wanting to go forward? Because I wanted to get into there's just so many different differences in the structure, in the way that it's used, in the way the brain goes wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But go right ahead.
I just really quickly wanted to, since we sort of brought up this question before, I was going to ask this at the end of the show, and I might again if Brian does indeed join us at some point, if his internet gets fixed in time. But since we brought up this idea of malicious intent, or kind of where are the feminists coming from with this gender as a social construct idea. I mean, really quickly, I will have to add that the poster child sort of for gender as a social construct, or rather, well, both. The poster child was actually a person, a male, who got reassigned to a female gender and was forced into a lot of questionable positions and situations with actually one of his siblings, who was a boy, and just in general been forced to act like a girl because, Dr. Money, which is just sort of ironic name, was the pioneer of gender theory. By that I mean that gender is a social construct and not in any way rooted in biology. And in fact, the guinea pig for sort of this theory and this approach to gender eventually committed suicide. He turned back to male, away from being forced, and had even his part of his genitals removed as in an effort to turn him into a girl. And that wasn't at all the life that David Raymer wanted for himself. And he eventually became to think of himself as male, as he always felt male on the inside anyway, regardless of what Dr. Money was trying to do. And then, eventually killed himself. So that's not really a good example of gender being a social construct. Now, I was going to ask my panelists, all of you guys, I was going to ask, why does feminism need this? I mean, here we have this video where, right off the bat, in the first 2 minutes, she said that, why do people look like they do, or men and women, that is, why they look different. Why do they have different preferences, like makeup, or tools and like hammers and stuff? Like, why is there a difference? And this braincraft person instantly said it's social conditioning. I will tell you guys, there is one single place in the world that I know of, maybe more places, but one prominent place in the world where they maintain this idea, where the research could be gathered, because you have a lot of feminist academics who are sitting around creating research that's not based on studies, it's not based on observation, it's not based on any kind of primatology or behavioralism. It is based on basically philosophy of the feminist theory. And they have, in Sweden specifically is what I'm talking about, they have this awesome documentary from a Norwegian man, I believe, who I will have to find a link and put in a low bar, who went around asking Swedish scientists, basically, what is their idea on gender differences, and all of them repeated word for word that it is a social construct, that it's just conditioning, that it's just the commercials and the colors pink and blue is what's causing it. And then when this documentary maker went around other places in the world and asked their opinions and got evidence of male and female monkeys, and children or babies as young as a few days old, having different preferences and what they look at based on their gender. That information was still not in any way enough for these Swedish scientists, who then later looked at it as part of the documentary. They still did not change their mind. They were like, oh, that's some other science, some weirdness. And that's what I mean about this postmodernism creeping into this discipline, creeping into the discipline of everything that touches feminism ends up getting this postmodernism.
That there's no truth, that there's no such thing as truth, and so it's like them actually trying to speak in a scientific form when they specifically are against everything that is science. They're against logic. They're against any kind of proof or anything other than just whatever it is that one individual feels is the truth. I mean, it's so completely antithetical to to anything having to do with science, and to try to present it in a scientific forum, it's just madness. It's like literally directly madness.
Well, I think I can answer why feminism needs this idea of gender as a social construct. I think that, at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, I think that feminism definitely is out for the destruction of masculinity. I think when masculinity is seen as the root of all evil, which it is under sort of the feminist perspective, they use this word unlearn a lot, right? So I think that this theory ties in with, well, if there's really no such thing as a man or a woman, then you can kind of unlearn masculinity. So you can unlearn this toxic part of yourself. It's very twisted, but I think that is why they would need this theory.
So they're trying to see us as that we can actually be made into good. We're not, so basically at the very basis of it is this ideation that what to be man is to be evil, and so therefore they want to give us the benefit of the doubt that we can be made civil and like the feminine, and so I think that maybe you've got a point there, that it's basically at its heart they want to think of us as redeemable, and by redeemable they mean to erase anything that is different from feminine, and entirely because they see what we are as intrinsically evil.
Yeah, it's very much like confess your sins type of thing. Like, feminism is such a cult, in my opinion. It's very much like you can unlearn your masculinity, you can be a better person. It's very that.
Well, I definitely would agree that there is a subset of the radical feminism, or the feminism 3.0. Well, those are slightly different. I mean, there's radical feminism where you have it going all the way back to Dworkin and people like Gail Dines and Naomi Wolf and Gloria Steinem, that are just, been fighting this fight for a while and are, vicious, and have also kind of subset of misandry there. And then we also have feminism 3.0, which is I would classify as the younger 3.0, being a play on words or an allusion to internet, because most of them congregate on social media, or specifically Tumblr, part of Tumblr anyway, because to me Tumblr is just porn, but apparently there's also a dark side of Tumblr where people like talk and share words and stuff. And you have there a subset of those 3.0, e-feminists. You have also a misandrist kind of a core. And those parts of feminism, for sure, definitely, I think I would agree with you guys that they do try to erase anything and everything that's masculine. Now, on the other hand, I think we also have other feminists that are part of the movement because it appeals to their, white knight senses, or just like wanting to be a good person and take care of those that are disenfranchised. And feminism says that it's everything that's good and bright in the world, so we need to just like be feminists. I mean, why wouldn't you want equality for women? Because that's what feminism means, right? But also they kind of have a crime of negligence, because I was thinking about this earlier when, preparing for the show. I asked myself this question, why does feminism needs this? And then I sort of kind of had this epiphany where it was like, wait a minute, last I was reading of a list made by Feminism Canada. They had this part of it that said that they support LGBTQITTS plus people. And since last I heard, that's added 3 new letters to this acronym.
Oh my God.
And that occurred, it dawned on me. I was like, wait a minute, there's so many dimensions of sexuality that are being, gender being a social construct. It is a social construct that feminists keep creating for themselves and people that are their friends, and other people. They keep slicing genders that are not 100% male or female. They keep adding the queer, and then the even more queer, and then super extra queer, and then there's sapiosexual and pansexual. And it's like, I know those are like sexual orientations, but there are also gender identities attached with some of those. And so you have ways to get academia money, to get grants, to have teaching positions, to speak around colleges, and to basically promote this, not even women's studies, but, feminist academia that 100% focuses on really made up stuff. It is in no way centered in reality, and we will make our case for why gender is not a social construct. We're about to talk about, a variety of ways in which brain styles and the way brains look is different. Before we go into the man and women differences specifically, and there are so many of those, so the 2 basic genders, I also want to add that we have evidence of gay brains being different from straight brains. And we have the brains of heterosexual men and homosexual women that are similar in their volume, and the fact that 2 brain hemispheres are not symmetrical. That's something that classifies male brains and homosexual women. But the brains of homosexual men and heterosexual women were also similar in volumes, and their 2 brain hemispheres were symmetrical. So we have, similarities, that there's more similarities between straight male brains and lesbian brains than there are between male and female brains. And same with homosexual men and female brains. Those 2 are more similar than male and female. So not only do we have differences that we'll go in detail about in the second hour, but we have even sort of surface detectable in PET scans and MRIs, let alone just the brain size and volume differences between men and women that don't really happen in gay men and women. So it seems like there is a slighter situation with this gender, male and female gender, and that brain type and brain size and brain areas and their volumes very directly kind of correlate to the sexuality, or the dominant versus submissive, or the masculine or feminine, or the, testosterone or estrogen. Those 2 types of hormones and existences seem to be intricately tied with each other.
See, that's what they'll try to take the fact that it's a continuum. Yes, it is indeed a continuum, and there are people who exist all along that continuum. They'll try to take that exceptional truth and make it into the rule that there is no male and female, whereas we're not saying, and these studies do not say, that there is not a generally male and generally female brain that is the majority. That is exactly what is going on, but also there is a continuum between, where people exist all along this continuum, and sometimes they'll have a certain brain area that is more feminized or more masculized than another brain area, and so that's how there is a mix of things, certainly, but there are also the dominant types. In other words, where you can say that for the most part, men's brains are like this because that is what the larger section of them are, like a large majority. But of course, there is, yes, a continuum. And so it's just the ability to see that there is both a binary and there is a continuum, and those are both one thing and one concept with when you look at it in a complex fashion instead of trying to oversimplify it. I think that that's one thing that we need to really kind of point out. Let's not oversimplify this. There is a continuum, and there are those who conform more to the binary, which is the majority.
Right, and before we get off the topic of gay and trans people, I think it's very interesting to note the conundrum that feminists and SJWs kind of get themselves in when they go on about how everything's a social construct, but at the same time want to claim that, gay people are born gay and trans people are born trans. It's like, which is it? You can't have it both ways. You just can't.
That's a really good point, and that was actually going to be my segue into talking about your personal experience of being a trans person, trans woman, and that is, if you have transgender people, they're transitioning from one gender to another. Well, if gender is a social construct, why would there need to be a transition? Why would there need to be hormone therapy? Why would there need to be any of that if it's all entirely basically made up and imposed on you as what they say that is? And once again, we see evidence of postmodernist thinking in the fact that logic is not employed in the slightest, because if they could see that what they're saying is, like you said, gay people are born gay, trans people are born trans, and they're born that way, it's biological, you can't at all say then that it's a social construct unless they have been hiding the definition of a social construct away from us, and they mean something other than a idea that society made up and holds you to. It really doesn't make any sense. Those two can't go together. As we frequently talk about, it's nature or nurture. What is the dominant one? How it does it work? Is it all 100% nature? Is it all 100% nurture? No, it's 50-50. That's usually the idea of it. And what feminists are doing, especially the third wave ones, are all nurture in one case and all nature in the other case, and that creates a paradox. Instead of having a continuum and 50-50 nature nurture, they have like the opposite ends of it that don't even work together.
Yeah, and it's not even like even saying 50-50 is a poor categorization of what we're trying to represent, which is a much more complex set of issues. It's just like some of the things that I'll bring up, and I've got a bunch of studies, and hopefully we're able to share my link that has all my notes and everything. But you have issues where the gender and sexual preference is altered by things that happen in the womb. It's altered by stress in childhood. It's altered by stress during the teens. In other words, there's all these points at which there are alterations, and I think where it comes from is because that for the longest time, gay people especially, have had to defend themselves against the simpleton idea when they're trying to say, well, you chose to be gay and that's why you're evil and blah blah blah. And so I think that's where they've got these two. That's why they have these two things instead of being able to look at it from a a more complex perspective. They're trying to fight against somebody's simpleton view, and when you fight against a simpleton view, you end up taking 100% the opposite and end up with a simpleton view yourself, because you're trying to fight against it. And that I think that's what the problem is because there's so many people for the longest time have been trying to say that homosexuality is completely a choice, and so they're trying to say, well, no, it's completely biological. Well, no, it's not any of those things. It's much more complex than that. There's many more factors that come into it, and so it's I think that's always the problem, is when we're fighting this binary thinking, we end up with poor answers, and I think that's how they got confused, and why you've got them defending two ends of something and coming out looking retarded. So.
Well, the irony of it is that feminists, while complaining about binary gender roles as something they need to smash, like the patriarchy, they're also the only ones that are actually upholding binary gender roles. Because if you look into actual neuroscience, and yeah, Richard was absolutely right. I will lead us into more, in-depth research that he has procured for the show. While there's information basically on so many different factors that have to do with what is it? Sorry, the word escapes me. I just call it fetal testosterone. Basically, the testosterone that the mother releases into the womb. There's even been studies with cortisol release, that's a stress hormone, and how that affects testosterone and estrogen and all the other aspects that determine sexuality. So basically, is what we're saying here. We have overwhelming evidence that hormones is what causes gender differences, and the overwhelming one, of course, that comes with determining male or female gender, to begin with, just those two, like straight female, straight male. It is testosterone itself that gets released in the fetal sac and all that, and it affects the genitals and the brain of the fetus. And based on the gender, the XY or the XX, there are different effects that testosterone has. And then there's more effects that get compounded to do with the environment of the parent, to do with genetics, to do with potential environmental factors, like literally the air or the plastics that are being consumed or breathed. And we start to see differences in heterosexuality or homosexuality. We even see differences in transgender brains versus regular brains. So there's an overwhelming amount of actual science. If you spend just 5 minutes searching, there is all of the science that the braincraft people could have looked at and actually talked about, but it seems that they are willingly and willfully siding with the Swedish model of thinking about gender and thinking about science, which is also the postmodernist idea, which kind of holds that there's no objective reality or truth, that words have meaning. Anybody's idea is just as good as the other one, and especially if it's the golden and the holy cow idea that is feminism, sacred cow that is, they're not going to be looking beyond the cozy sort of gender is a social construct, feminist academia perspective, which is unfortunate, because if they call themselves scientists, or if they actually want to help anyone, any individual, you have to look at what the brain is doing, because as my advisor used to say, the mind is what the brain does. And everything that we do and think and how we are, and basically our happiness as human beings, has to do with the way the brain functions. So there's been evidence of heterosexuality, bisexuality, homosexuality. All of these peculiarities are determined by brain structure and differences in brain chemistry. And there are even certain areas that scientists have identified that they believe determine sexuality in an individual. These areas include the hypothalamus and the amygdala. And those are also different between men and women. That's one of the two main areas that differ in size and volume and activation in men and women. So there's been a landmark study by Savick and Lindstrom, and indicated that there are cerebral differences in homosexual and heterosexual individuals. There are differences in brain anatomy, activities, and neurological connections. And the brain scan images of the subjects who participated in the study showed that the brains of homosexual individuals exhibited similar structure and functionality and activation as that of heterosexual individuals of the opposite gender. According to the study, lesbians and straight men have similar brain structures, and I already went over that. And gay male and female brains have more similar structure. Now, another study found that brains of male to female transsexual individuals and men and women found that volumes of gray matter across the different regions of the brains of male to female transsexuals are more or less similar to that of brains of the men. However, the men to female transsexual exhibited slightly greater volume of gray matter in the right pituitary region of the brains compared to the men. And they may have the same physical sexual characteristics as men, but they report feeling like women. So this study bolsters the claim that this brain structure plays a significant role in determining gender identity. We have this localized area in brain volume that is different, based on not feeling like you belong to your body, even though your body is the same, and for the most part in your brain, therefore, is the same to a man. So, this is interesting to me, because we have not only male to female transsexual, with us here, Blair, but, whenever you do transition, there are hormones and, like testosterone for female to male and estrogen for male to female, that you actually have to take, and so you can supplement yourself with a hormone, and that will lead you to the gender of your choice. So the fact that we can do that alone blows a huge gaping hole in the idea that was presented by Braincraft and Lacey Green. What has been your personal experience on any of that, and is that has been true for you, Blair?
Absolutely. I've known, I mean, I've always known that, behavior is definitely hormonally driven to a great extent, but since transitioning, it's become just glaringly obvious to me. Most notably, and for anyone who doesn't know, I'm male to female transgender. So I did start hormone therapy, and a lot of my behaviors shifted. At first, not as dramatically, but over time, definitely. I think the funniest one is before my transition, you would have never caught me saying that I wanted kids. I hated kids. I still, to a certain extent, don't like being around them. But I have this overwhelming sense of like a longing to be a mother now, which is really, really strange. It's so um, opposite of my character prior to transition. Um, I'm also a lot more emotional. My sex drive is pretty much tanked. And what are some other differences? Um, I guess I can't really think of any on the spot, but those are just the three main ones.
Right, and thank you for sharing. But yeah, I mean that's something I've definitely observed as well with other transsexual women, and in general, just the very thought that we have gender transition and it's mediated by hormones. So how can feminist theory persist for one more minute? That gender is a social construct. Um,
Yeah, that's why I've always said, being transgender is not compatible with feminist ideology at all, which is kind of mind-boggling that so many trans people are feminists, and
well,
that's never
that's
really made sense to me.
That's where I'd have to get conspiratorial for a minute. And since, well, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding about, based on what many transgender women have said, is that they have a very intense adoration and respect for their mothers, or in general, female figures, the feminine gender. They really adore everything that has to do with women. Therefore, they want to be women. And sometimes we see people who internalize misandry. They really strongly hate maleness, and they have frequently grown up in homes that have a feminist slant to into the mother, to the ideas that they propagate. And some of those ideas are really, really toxic towards men, as you were saying, wanting to basically erase the male gender. And that is what I believe some transsexual people do and what they go through. And that's why they're sort of on the SJW, hysterics side spectrum anyway, because they are mentally imbalanced in the first place, in the terms of being very not necessarily not feeling right in their skin, because that was more of a biological thing, but it was induced through social stress and the constant, basically, barrage of their mothers. Because we know that people can be so bullied and or abused by their parents, etc., so that they would be depressed and kill themselves. So I mean, it has a really strong effect on stress and emotions and neurochemicals, therefore. And so, it's not that outlandish to think that somebody could be basically bullied into hating maledom so much, and if they already had kind of a worship of the feminine induced by their mothers, that they would, basically cut off their penis because they hate it. And there were some transsexuals who even said that, I've seen. So.
Yeah, I've definitely witnessed an element of misandry when it comes to the trans community. I think it's because, I mean, a lot of trans girls are quite literally running away from their masculinity. I mean, when you go on hormone therapy, you're literally trying to get rid of testosterone and supplement it with estrogen. And a lot of us, I really don't consider myself to be this way. Obviously, I make videos about men's issues, but um, they see that innate masculinity within themselves, and they hate it. And so they kind of go through life and they begin hating it, even seeing it in other people. So I think that's definitely an aspect of it. And
What about their relationship with their mothers? The same way? Do they tend to have a good relationship with their mothers, or a poor one, in
um,
your opinion?
I can speak from my personal experience. I've had an amazing relationship with my mom. She's still my best friend to this day. My relationship with my dad wasn't as great. He's no longer with us anymore, but it wasn't that great, and it wasn't because I didn't identify with a masculine role model, but I would say it was more so because of he didn't really understand why I was always so innately feminine, because that was something that was, I mean, I've always been a very feminine person. And so I think that created a little bit of conflict between us. I don't think it was because I had an aversion to a masculine role model, but I think that element of a stronger relationship with the mother is probably prominent.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually have I grew up like I was nearly autistic. Yeah, I was so like Asperger's type, younger, and so and with my father being like a hyper masculine Italian kind of guy, I kind of found out after the fact that he kind of saw me as like really effeminate, even though I didn't have any homosexual leanings. It was just basically if you're nerdy, you're seen as effeminate by the really masculine types. And so I know the kind of treatment you get when you're not seen as living up to a father's standards of what you're supposed to be in a masculine sense. And it's just weird because I mean I did develop masculinity later on in my life, but it's just when I was younger I was just very socially awkward, and and so that was just interpreted as feminine.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can see that, speaking of primate reactions to people who are outside the norm, we actually have evidence of, when we talk about the monkey studies and all that, some of the supporting evidence that preference towards toys, or in general male specific versus female specific behaviors and preferences, is something that is mediated by hormones. And there's been a study a few years ago by a group of British researchers that found that girls with a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, who basically experience abnormally high levels of male sex hormone androgen while in the womb, they prefer to play with the male typical toys. So we have, not that we have any female to male transsexuals here, but me personally being a atypical female, there certainly is a slider as well for different hormone levels in people. I mean, gender is not between your legs, it's in your brain. The truer words have never been said, because it's really all, well, and throughout your body, as the hormone levels of testosterone to estrogen differences is what sort of guides behaviors and interests, rather worldviews, I would say. And there it seems to be this very strong sort of divide, like the toys, dolls rather, for girls, for female monkeys too, which is kind of the socialization and the networking and the kind of the emotional realm that women excel at. So they prefer that, while in the male and the more male-brained monkeys and boys, they choose trucks and balls. And the question was, why do boys prefer toy vehicles? The debate still continues, and there's been a study that investigated whether the basically the concept was, maybe boys, let me just preface this before I go into the study. The concept was, well, maybe boys prefer balls and trucks because they really like to move around a lot, like, I guess, contributing to that idea that boys are more ADHD than girls, that they just like run around. And so maybe dolls don't offer them this idea, or rather a capacity of movement, but toys and trucks, and like ball toys and trucks, do. So they did a study. Alexander did a study in, I think, 2009. I could be wrong about that, but it was a study whether a 19-month-old move around when they play with trucks and balls more than when they play with dolls, and they're found to be no difference really in the movement. And so the debate still persists, and they don't really understand why toddlers with higher levels of testosterone are more active, but that still doesn't really translate to playing with dolls sedentarily versus playing with balls and trucks in an active manner. But it's because the ones that have high testosterone, they move around a lot regardless. If it's a ball or a doll or whatever they have that is given to them, they're going to move around a lot. And the ones that, so it's like the idea is, why or the question rather, is why does this happen? Why do boys prefer balls and trucks overwhelmingly, even across species, and why do girls or females prefer dolls? And it's interesting to me that neuroscience has not connected itself with primatology, because we see these sort of, it's easiest for me anyway to come up with a theory that, well, evolutionarily, and if you see what do primates do, well, the females spend a lot of time grooming and maintaining their female hierarchy, while men get sticks and try to make them into things. And there's also this sort of divide in hypermasculine and hyperfeminine brains, where hyperfeminine brains, they just want to gossip and put on lipstick, right? That is once again very much maintaining social networking and social hierarchy, while men, they like to build stuff, they like to work with their hands. It's more of a tools minded versus a social mind attitude. And that'll tie really well in with some autism research that we'll go into just a little bit later. But before that, I really quickly want to add the effects of testosterone, since I was just briefly mentioning it, that in human males, the variation of fetal testosterone predicts later local gray matter volume of specific brain regions, and other ways in which we clearly can connect fetal testosterone with somebody being male, with them having different areas of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the amygdala, which are the two major brain areas that are different between men and women. So we over and over have ties between testosterone and estrogen hormones and brain size differences, brain structure differences, which directly evolve or show themselves in behavior differences. And that holds true for homosexual and heterosexual people. As I mentioned, the hypothalamus and the amygdala are the two brain areas, other than the corpus callosum, brain craft, that are different in men and women. And we see that in homosexual men and heterosexual women, there were more connections from the left amygdala, and in the homosexual women and heterosexual men, there were more connections from the right amygdala. So not only are there differences in which side of the amygdala is more connected to the rest of the brain between men and women, but that holds true for feminine men that are gay and masculine women who are lesbians. That very sort of directly kind of goes to the hypothalamus and the amygdala. What are those brain areas? What is that? What is happening? Well, the amygdala can be known or called as the social learning and fear center of the brain. And the hypothalamus is the brain region that actually activates the flight or flight response, and it has to do with mating behavior. My professor used to call it was the 4 Fs. It's fighting, fucking, feeding, and I forget the other F, but it is also... There you go. It is also full of androgen receptors, so once again, hormones there. The hypothalamus is actually really, important and interesting part of the brain, because it kind of ties a lot of our instinctual primate sort of basic behaviors together, and it's kind of a little hub of instinctual and reflex and subconscious sort of behavior, I would say, since most of the executive function and higher function thought happens in the prefrontal cortex. So the hypothalamus also has differences, of course, between men and women, and between heterosexual people and homosexual people. And it is about 2.5 times or 2.2 times larger in men than women, and it contains twice as many cells in men than women. So this large size depends on the amount of male sex hormone or androgens. The difference in the area is only apparent after a child is 4 years old, so it still has a kind of a grace period of potentially this is the time when the hypothalamus could be really affected by outside factors. So since we see the actual size differences by 4 years old, maybe until 4 years old, the hypothalamus is still kind of in a state of flux. And perhaps that is where we see the environment effects of people who end up being, transsexuals due to abuse or, kind of growing up around a mother hero figure and not really having a father, or having been severely abused as a boy and just wanting to run away from your boyness. So because we do know if environment does affect things like that, and I'll go into more detail about that in just a little bit, since scientists pretty much found the area of the brain that seems to correspond the strongest with gender identity and sexuality, and that is the bed nucleus of the striatum terminalis. And I'll go into that in just a little bit, but there's still more on the hypothalamus. That thing is amazing. The shape of the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, which is involved in circadian rhythms and reproduction cycles, is different in men and women, which of course that makes sense. In males, the nucleus is shaped like a sphere, whereas in females it is more elongated. The volume is similar, but the difference in shape may be due to difference in connections. And we also have talked in one of our previous shows about the fight or flight reflex that is mediated by stress and adrenaline in men is not exactly what happens with women. In women, we have more of a tend and befriend oxytocin response. So, part of this brain region being different in size and shape might have to do with where it is getting the connections from for other, hormones and neurotransmitters.
Yeah, can I pop in for a second there? Also going back to the talk about the trucks and versus dolls and all that sort of thing. The study that I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this thing with the 949 people, and basically the cerebellum is your that's the part of you that controls your body and movement, and it's really the physical part of you, and that's kind of what they were seeing when they were looking at the way that it was interhemispheric versus intrahemispheric connection, and the way that worked out. It seems as though the reason why men have the greater interhemispheric connection in the cerebellum is because of being more physical and more tuned into the physical realm, whereas most of our forebrain and the larger brain has been it's been postulated that the reason why we developed it was for social calculation, and then you find that is basically what where women have the greater interconnectivity, is in that part of the brain that initially developed for social calculation. But that is, of course, before we had the huge difference in change in our the what's it called, the conscious revolution to whenever we first started using tools. Basically, I guess it was we first saw the evidence of that around 80,000 years ago or something now. But but we had the same brain size for 300,000 years, or more. So anyhow, go ahead.
Well, yeah, just what you were saying a minute ago completely ties into my next point about the hypothalamus, talking about what the brain's evolved to do. And, you might say that, women talk so much and they don't talk as much as men. And that is actually scientifically supported. In men, the hypothalamus has well, 2 points. One, this is not quite related, and then I'll show you how it is related to the speech. Hypothalamus has a higher number of androgen receptors in men than in women. So the hypothalamus is also, differently responding to testosterones and other male hormones in men versus women. And there are also differences in the androgen receptors in the horizontal diagonal band of Broca, which is also a sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. And what does Broca's area do? Well, it is an area that functions for speech production. So literally the brain area that creates speech has differing sizes and amounts of androgen receptors between men and women. And other things that male and females respond differently to is the ovarian steroids. And if you give the same hormone to men versus women, they're going to respond to it differently because they're not the same in hormones and a variety of other ways, not just specifically the brain differences in size and area shapes. Now, there's also differences in the stria terminalis, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, and that has been identified as, as I mentioned, as the sexual, gender, sexuality, whatever center of the brain. Now, there's been research, or at least they've tried to determine whether or not stress or fear or anxiety has any effect on the sexual, dimorphic and a little bed of sexuality and gender that is the bed nucleus. Um, this is probably linked, or it should be linked, to the fact that there were done primatology studies, and really quickly, let me do a sidestep here about in rat studies, etc. When they do ovariectomization, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. It's when you completely remove ovaries from a female rat. She will start doing mounting behavior, so she starts behaving like a male. And in social defeat stress situations, you see, and with the presence of stress hormones in abundance, or in certain stages of a pregnancy that fetus got exposed to stress hormones, it will end up presenting its genitals like females do. So bending down and presenting is the feminine behavior, and then mounting is the masculine behavior. So when certain things happen, like straight up removing ovaries that produce estrogen and the female hormones, the female mouse will start acting like a male mouse. And when you have a lot of social stress and exposure to stress hormones in men or male mice, they end up being gay, so to speak, and they end up presenting like females do. So they were looking at the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, that is a limbic forebrain structure, and it receives a lot of heavy projections from the amygdala, which we've mentioned is the fear and the social learning center of the brain, and it is different in men and women, and what side of it, left or right, activates or sends more signals, or is bigger also. Now, it was found that there's not really all that much evidence that the bed nucleus is in any way affected by stress or anxiety or fear or any of that, but recently there have been studies that show that the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis does participate in certain types of anxiety and stress responses. So this connection to the amygdala actually does activate or affect the bed nucleus somehow. And in this work that is published in Science Direct, they reviewed these findings, and they found an emerging pattern of evidence that although the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis may not be necessarily ready or there for rapid onset short duration behaviors, which occur in response to specific threats, such as hypothalamus would be doing for fight or flight. But in fact, the bed nucleus does mediate slower onset, longer lasting responses to anxiety and stress that frequently accompany sustained threats, and that may persist even after the threat termination. So we see that this area that's related to sexuality pretty directly is also sensitive to specifically sustained threats of stress, anxiety, and fear, and that may remain even after the threat is gone. So to me, this very sort of clearly outlines a way in which a child who was born somewhere in the middle of the bisexual spectrum perhaps would get a constant social defeat stress and rejection by their mother if they're more of a feminist bully type, and by other girls because they're awkward, and by other boys because they're feminized. And that constant social pressure by way of the bed nucleus can lead to a more middle of the road bisexual person becoming gay. So, I mean, what would you say about that, Richard, if you have any information on that? Am I correct in my hypothesis?
Yeah, sorry, I kind of was looking into what I was about to talk about, which was that there is another area of the brain called the medial preoptic area that is very strongly correlated with sexual behavior, and it too is modulated by stress. Specifically, like one of the studies I have here is a causative factor of copulatory disorders in rats following social stress, and basically they found that that there was a change in that there was a decrease in mounting influencing behavior as lowered testosterone levels were found after social defeat stress. And then in addition to that, there was another thing having to do with stress and the medial preoptic, the medial preoptic, and that was that early social stress in female guinea pigs induces masculinization of their adult behavior and the corresponding changes in their brain and neuroendocrine function. So in both cases, the stress actually changed their brain sexual type. So and so then in addition to that, they found like they've done things when it comes to like lesioning that area. The medial preoptic, they did bilateral damage to sexually dimorphic medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus in male ferrets, causes female typical preference and for body odors. So basically there was body odor preference. Then in addition to that, the lesion males also showed other female behaviors such as their partner preference. They would pick the female, a male would normally pick a female partner, and then they would start picking male partners instead. So there's absolutely a lot of indication that the stress response is involved in changes to areas that have everything with behavior and hormonal profiles. There's large differences in the way that plays out. Blair, did you want to say something?
Yeah, in terms of humans, I think that's really interesting that we can observe sexuality shifts in animals, because I have known so many male to female trans people who undergo HRT, and then their sexuality definitely shifts dramatically. I've known trans girls who would date women before the transition and then find themselves completely attracted to men and vice versa. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah, since my co-host left me here, I'm gonna go off to another part that I was wanting to talk about, which was the way in which the brain is used. So one of the things that they found is that there is, along with the study that we had talked about earlier about sexual orientation and its basis in brain structure and function, another study here was that there was neuroimaging differences in spatial cognition between male to female transsexuals before and during hormone therapy. And so I'm going to read an excerpt here. It's the classical mental rotation network was activated in all three groups, but significant differences within this network were observed. Men without gender identity disorder exhibited significantly greater activation of the left parietal cortex, a key region for mental rotation processes, and both transsexual groups revealed stronger activation of temporo-occipital regions in comparison with men without the GID. So basically what they're saying there is that there's something that is well known to be different in the way that we use our brains between males and females, and that it has to do with the way in which we do mental rotations. And that's like whenever you look at a picture and you're supposed to decide what it would look like if it's rotated in 3 dimensions or in 2 dimensions, and the ways in which that we use those brain areas actually changed for male to female transsexuals before and then during hormone therapy when they compared those two situations. So there's actually like a difference in the way that we use the specific areas of our brain and what area of the brain that we do use. So it's just fascinating how many different things are going on, and when we oversimplify these systems, it just leads to just terrible ideas and ideations, and we've got that on both sides, whether it be like the hyper conservative views or the hyper liberal views. They end up just oversimplifying it, and when instead they need to look at things with a little more eye towards educating themselves about the way that all these things interact. So Cherry, did you want to continue forward with okay. Well, then I'm going to go forward with some more studies on. Yes.
Did Blair want to say something? I'm not sure if I'm.
No, she did.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. So yeah, I just wanted to go over a few different studies that had to do with the way the brain is shaped. There's They've done magnetic resonance imaging. Let's see. The sexual dimorphisms of adult brain volumes were more evident in the cortex, with women having larger volumes relative to cerebrum size, particularly in frontal and medial paralimbic cortices. Men had larger volumes relative to cerebrum size in frontal medial cortex, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. Let's see, where's some of the other studies here? So they've done imaging studies where they made mice that were transgenic, so they made some genetic alterations to them so that they could literally tag the brain areas that would be changed in response to androgen, so in response to male hormones. And so they were able to see very clearly, there's just no doubt at all whatsoever that the brain is altered in a number of ways physically by hormones, and so there are differences there. But of course, those hormones can be changed, as Cherry was saying, in a variety of ways, having to do with factors starting in the womb and happening all throughout life. So let's see. Yes, there was, of course, one of the things that is kind of a question about when it comes to sexual dimorphism in the brain is whether or not the corpus callosum is actually larger in women or not. And the answer to that is that, most recently there was they used the database of all these different MRI studies, and they did a control for brain size and age, and so that, because of course there are differences in brain sizes between men and women, and what they found is when it comes to comparing it to brain size, the corpus callosum in females is generally larger by a fairly significant amount. So that's one of the other ways in which the brain is physically different. Then, of course, something that Cherry was talking about was the way in which fear interacts with the brain. So I want to move to the way the brain is used. So the way that one of the things that is a difference in the chemical ways in which our brain is used is the difference between oxytocin and vasopressin. Men have more vasopressin use in the brain, where women would use oxytocin. And the way in which vasopressin and oxytocin act in the brain are actually they're different with the way in which they interact with the amygdala. So once again, it's going back to the amygdala as being a major differentiator between the sexes, and even the way in which fear is processed is changed by those chemicals. So there's just so many differences between men and women that it comes down to. There's spatial cognition, of course, and let's see where I'm going to have to catch up in my notes here. Give me just a second.
And yes, all the citations will be available in the low bar situation after the show, or if you can refresh right now, you'll see it, hopefully.
Okay. Yeah. So I went over the opposite effects of oxytocin and vasopressin. Some of the interesting things is that there are ways in which the brain becomes unhealthy in men and women. When it comes to aging, we also actually have the differences there. Like there's a study here that's the disturbed sexual dimorphism of brain activation during mental rotation in schizophrenia. So what they did is they looked at schizophrenic males and females, and behavioral data revealed in diagnosis by sex interaction with healthy men performing significantly better than schizophrenia men, and no significant difference between healthy women and schizophrenia women. So basically, in schizophrenia, there is an alteration that happens to men that doesn't really happen to women. So perhaps the way in which we treat men and the way in which we treat women shouldn't be the same. And there's, let's see.
Are you saying that women are just always crazy?
I might be saying that. There was no difference. No. All right, then there was also a left greater than right asymmetry of the amygdala, varied as a function of gender and mood congruence of delusional beliefs due to asymmetrical enlargement of the left amygdala in women presenting with predominantly mood incongruent delusion. So this is another point at which in a first presentation of mental illness, there was a difference between men and women in the amygdala. So some of this comes back to what I was eventually going to get to, which was the link to autism. So autism for a long period of time has been seen as a there's kind of an autism theory that it is a hyper masculinization of the brain, and there's a lot of there's a lot of information out there that you can go and look that up, and there's a tremendous amount of support for this theory. So let me look at one of these studies here. So there's sex differences in autism, brain function during verbal fluency, and mental rotation. And this is an excerpt from that. So during mental rotation, there was a significant diagnosis by sex interaction across occipital, temporal, parietal, middle frontal regions with a greater activation in AS males. That's Asperger's syndrome, and typical females compared to AS females and typical males. These findings suggest a complex relationship between autism and sex that is differentially expressed in verbal and visuospatial domains. That shouldn't come to anybody as a surprise, since we all kind of already know this through the our interactions with people who are more towards that spectrum, the more Asperger spectrum. That verbally they're not quite the same, and also in visuospatial abilities, they lose in one area, they gain in another. And basically what this study says is that Asperger's females were more male-like and Asperger's males were more female-like. So that is an interesting thing that I'm going to move forward with here. So here's another excerpt. On the verbal fluency task, despite equivalent task performance, both males and females with AS showed enhanced activation of left occipital parietal and inferior prefrontal activity compared to controls. So that's basically saying that both male and female Asperger's syndrome were different from everyone else. So in other words, the way in which they use their brain was like each other, but different from everyone else. And then autism. Here's another study that's autism attenuates sex differences in brain structure. It combined voxel-based, blah, blah, blah. So let me give you an excerpt from that, and that is just basically to kind of further what I'm trying to bring about here, which is just a look at the way in which autism and the brain it has to do with sexual dimorphism. Significant interactions were found between sex and diagnosis in total white matter volume, regional gray matter volume, and the right parietal operculum, and fractional anisotropy in the body of the CC cingulum and CR. Post hoc comparisons indicated the typical sexual dimorphism was found in controls whereby males have a larger FA and total white matter volume, and was absent or attenuated in participants with AS. So basically this is saying that Asperger's men and women were less sexually dimorphic and more similar to each other than normal controls were. So there's, once again, it's another just directly showing that Asperger's in men and women basically makes them more like each other, but less like the rest of the population. Let's see. All right, so there is a male prevalence in autistic spectrum disorders, and Cherry wants to say something.
Yeah, real quick. Before we move on, because this is something I'm going to have to put on my tinfoil fedora. And, since we're kind of talking about atmospheric or environmental effects on children or in general gender, brains, all of that, I'm going to have to, as I said, put on my tinfoil fedora, as there has been, we know plastic bottles, unless they have the note rather on it that they're BPA free, they will most likely have bisphenol A, and it is part of a plastic cocktail, and it's quite toxic, and in fact it's been linked to prostate cancer and other undesirable cancers, and just generally no good. One of the reasons you should not leave a plastic water bottle in your car and then let it heat up and then drink that water. Just don't ever do that. It'll be full of BPA, and also certain hot water and plastic interactions will leach out and draw out that BPA. Now, there's been a study done in 2003, actually, by Kubo et al., and it was on bisphenol A exposure in the womb, and it showed that it altered the sexual differentiation of the brain and behavior in rats. Their study found that there were certain brain areas, even being exposed to something as a safe level of a BPA, but it still had effect on the brain structure, such as the locus coeruleus, which is believed to be a key brain center for anxiety and fear. Normally, it is larger in females, what a surprise, than in males, and that as well as the hypothalamus, that's another area they looked at, which is called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area, plays a role in regulating sexual behaviors, and it's been proposed in humans to be important for determining sexual orientation. And normally this area is larger in males than females. Now, whenever they exposed these rats to safe levels of BPA, they found that the BPA exposure reversed sex differences in the size of the locus coeruleus, so it actually made men more anxious and fearful, if I remember it correctly. And it eliminated the usual sex differences in the open field behavior test without affecting sexual development of the reproductive system. So it affected some really interesting areas that have to do with sexual differences. Specifically, it kind of, did almost what autism kind of seems to do, where it made the male and females more similar to each other, but it did not actually affect their sexual development or their reproductive system. So, and I just wanted to throw that out there, because it was right
Wow, yeah,
along.
perfect timing. That was great. It goes right along with it. So eventually, what I'm trying to get towards here is where I'm going to start speculating. I'm gonna stop talking about the direct studies and things like that, and go into kind of a speculation digression here. So you have these differences that are usually you find in the amygdala, and that are correlated with maleness, and it's not perfect correlation, but it is very strong, and that's why the hypermasculinization theory of autism is something that is still very widely seen as a valid theory to work by. However, so let's see. All right, so there is a theory that is that's an autism that has to do with the autism theory, sexual dimorphism, and it's the something called the relevance detection theory of autism, and I've got that at the bottom of my notes here, where basically what they're looking at is like, how do we look at this from a theory perspective? And one of the things that they're finding is that it seems to be that, so if the amygdala has to do with fear and social learning, then the whole point is that the brain is kind of designed to pick up cues that are important to that animal. So when it comes to a social animal, being ostracized from your group, if you're a gregarious animal, especially in harsh conditions, that is a death penalty. So that's one of the biggest dangers that you will face as a social animal, is to be ostracized from a group, which is why, of course, all of the social mechanics and all of that sort of thing and socialization is so extremely important, and that's why it's both fear and social learning in the amygdala. So but then here we have this autism thing, and now one of the things that people frequently think of things as disorders, and instead of thinking of it as a disorder, they need to think of it as a difference or a differentiation, because I think that what we're looking at is the reason why human beings had that revolution in tools use was because of what they're kind of getting at in this paper. That is, it has to do with relevance detection, that it has to do with what is relevant to my survival. It determines the way in which you start gathering information, the way in which you say, this is important information, this is pointless, worthless information. And I think that when you see how stress is involved, and then basically I think it is kind of a system designed to deal with ostracization of an animal. So an animal becomes ostracized at an early age, then they need to be able to make tools. They need to be able to make do on their own. They need to be able to adapt to circumstances that are not reliant upon a social system, but instead reliant upon a physical system, upon going out there and making a difference and figuring things out out in a physical world instead of in the mental social arena, which was that was the primary reason why we needed all that brain space. And that's one of the questions that have come up. And like one of my favorite books was Big Brain, and where they're talking about, well, why did we develop this really huge brain when we only have tools use, very recently, where we had this huge brain long before that, before we have any evidence of tools. We were just another kind of monkey, basically. And so the difference is that I believe that our genetic predisposition to have autism and that spectrum in low levels is just like, Cherry, do you remember there was a study where they found that schizophrenia, there are certain things that it grants as benefits. I'm not sure what it is, but basically anything that is typically seen as a disorder also has some sort of benefit. Like, for instance, the sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia, of course, grants some benefit when it comes to resistance against what's the name of the malaria. So once again, I believe that is also true of the of autism and autism spectrum, which is Asperger's. Is that basically what it is that by disconnecting from the social arena and changing the what's relevant, what information do you save and what information do you throw away, goes away from knowing who did Barbara smack and is her little facial expression mean that she's gonna all of that stuff that you can track. If it's instead that's thrown away, and what's looked at is, how do I make something? How do I survive now that my survival is not dependent on the group but only dependent upon me? And I think that is where that what we think of as a disorder, and it's actually both an order and a disorder, where it made us a little more, of course, when it goes terribly wrong, we end up being like a computer, and there's definitely a cognitive loss by becoming too narrow-minded, too obsessive, and too focused, as those who have very severe forms of autism. But then in smaller amounts, as a continuum, it grants the ability to focus on something that you might not otherwise focus upon, and to obsess about something that you might not otherwise obsess about. And I think that's by seeing things as having both a positive and negative aspect to them, I think that we end up understanding things better. And I think that is my theory anyway, that I believe that perhaps autism and it developed specifically, and it is the genesis of civilization. It is the genesis of tool use, and it because of that disconnect from sociology, or excuse me, I don't know what word I'm trying to make. I'm making one up. The disconnect from the social arena that gave us the ability to focus on the physical world. And of course, like I said, what we see is the more masculine brain is more focused on that which is physical, and whereas the more feminine brain is focused on that which is more just the cerebral, or I guess they would have seen it as the spiritual world, when it comes to the way in which everybody's interacting and who's doing what and what they might do, and keeping up with all what all the other monkeys are doing, instead of focusing on what you can do to change your specific environment. So do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I've heard a few other people talk about the theory that there are positive aspects to having what we typically view as disorders, but I would be wondering what you would say about how that lends to gender identity disorder. Like, what would be the positive aspects of gender identity disorder?
That's a good question. I mean, typically, I've seen in there's a lot of animals that will switch genders for when there's overpopulation, basically as kind of a way to manage the situation from in other words, it's genetically pre-programmed for them to start doing this so that it saves the larger organism that is the whole of the group, because there's something called, like in bacteria and things like that, there's something called quorum sensing, where what happens is they produce chemicals, and then when chemical concentrations reach a certain amount, they all are capable of doing one thing at the same time. And so it's a form of communication. And the same sort of thing happens sociologically in animals and in humans, that when we sense that there is a certain environment, we kind of have these pre-programmed switches that get everybody to kind of do the same sorts of things at the same time. And I think that may be part of it is kind of a group mechanic, that it's for helping the group. There's other there's also one of the things that's common in, I think it's cuttlefish, is that there are certain groups where instead of them being actually changing their breeding habits, what they do instead is they are changing their appearance habits for the purpose of gaining breeding rights. So what they do is they pretend to be female, and of course I'm not saying it would be something that anyone's consciously doing or anything like that, but perhaps that is the whole bisexual thing, where perhaps when someone is bisexual, then they are capable of enhancing their breeding rights by appearing female, because that changes the way in which males and females interact, and specifically in cuttlefish, it wards off some of the other males, and so it's a crafty way for them to gain greater breeding rights. So I think there's probably a lot of different reasons that it might show up in different people and in different ways. I think that you're going to have people who are going more towards it, and then of course there's just environment. We've got so many different things going on in our environment with plastics and things of that nature, where sometimes it may not be advantageous necessarily, or it could be something that we can't really elucidate the long-term consequences. But for the most part, right off the bat, whenever it comes to the animals, whenever they're changing gender, it's usually for the good of the group. They're basically doing something to help the larger group by doing that.
Yeah, I tend to see being trans and being gay as a sort of like mental, or not mental, but a genetic defect, but that might just be an oversimplification.
Oh,
Yeah, it almost certainly is one of those things where everything has positives and negatives. That's one thing I did want to finish off with, is when it comes to the autism and things like that. We always talk about in the U.S. we talk about individuality. Individuality is great. It's fantastic. It's the best thing ever. Well, the thing is, individuality is also self-centeredness and a lack of cooperation with the group. And then it's like, oh well, let's see, cooperation. Cooperation is the greatest thing ever. You got to always cooperate. Yeah, except cooperation is also the thing that makes us all in lockstep conformity to be like Nazis. And so in other words, no matter what you pick to try to say that's the best thing ever, it's the worst thing ever, you usually end up finding out, if you look at it for long enough, that there's something else that's doing that kind of tends to balance it as well. You were going to say something, Chair?
not until you mute your mic. So I usually try to wait. Otherwise the echo is just crazy. But no, I wanted to add to the, what is the positives of perhaps the identity disorder or just gayness in general. And I would say that on one hand, from a spiritual perspective, you have the two soul, I think or what it was called, the Indians. They viewed transgender or men in women's bodies, or vice versa. But usually, there you go. They were usually men who were feminine. They viewed them as, divine sort of middleman between them and the spirits. So they had kind of a special place in society, and the people valued the sort of wisdom and connection to, both sides of the world, or both sides of the spirit that they had. So on that, from that sort of perspective, there could be explanation for it in neuroscience and things like that, because we do have evidence, don't we, Richard, of gray or white matter being different between gay men versus straight men, and that basically we can tell or sort of say that gay men would be in a way smarter than straight men based on certain volumes of gray and white matter.
Yeah, well, basically, what you end up having with is that one of the things that they found in science, people who are men who are more scientifically, what's the word for it? I don't know. People who end up in science, basically, they did some looking at it, and some of the ways in which you can see the level of testosterone or estrogen. One of the things that they found is they either had an abundance of estrogen when they get into science, or they had a very large abundance of testosterone. And what happens is when you have a tremendous amount of testosterone, you end up turning that into estrogen. So in each case, scientifically minded people, either they had something that made it where they were just had more estrogen because from wherever, for whatever reason, and that leads, of course, to greater levels of myelination. Or they had so much testosterone that they also then had higher levels of estrogen as well. So in both cases, the increased estrogen and therefore a greater feminization of their brain specifically led to kind of a best of both worlds thing, where you end up having greater inner hemispheric connection because of the greater myelination, and then also greater intra-hemispheric connection. So there's kind of a the whole idea that they had of the two-souled, being their shamans and things like that. It seems like there's a very good reasoning why they thought that, is because usually what you're going to have is anybody who is closer to the middle is going to have a brain that tends to pull from both. Now, in saying that, there's also those people who tend to be the extremity of both. Instead, you can have the best of both worlds, but you can also have the worst of both worlds as well. That was one of the interesting things. Whenever it came to, I think it's sociopaths, there was always some sort of alteration of the corpus callosum, where they were basically what tends to happen, it seems, is that there's a that the hemispheres start to connect in some sort of abnormal way, and either they become extremely separated, so they're basically capable of having the extreme the extremity of both, or they're together in some way. I don't know exactly what I'm talking about here, because it's something I'm just kind of going on memory, but it's interesting to speculate about.
Well, going further on this aspect of like a sort of duality of masculine and feminine, I think it's interesting to note that we see an overrepresentation of trans people in STEM. I've known a lot of trans people that are in STEM.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's once again, it's not really a big surprise when you look at the neurobiology behind it. It tends to make sense that you have those things, and and going back to the extremities, one of the things that when it comes to people who are more mathematically minded, which tend to be very, very strongly on the Asperger spectrum to autistic spectrum, we tend to think of that as like some sort of like great thing by itself. But one of the things that you'll find is those same people, just like someone who is an autistic savant who can memorize and regurgitate massive numbers of facts and figures and do calculations, they are missing something, just like a computer is missing something. Just because you can use your brain more like a computer doesn't necessarily mean you have gained without losing. It usually means that you have gained and also lost at the same time, that there ends up being kind of a trade-off. And so you find that with the extremely mathematically minded, you kind of have a pedantic thing, and then you have people who go into the other end of the spectrum. They kind of lose any structure of knowledge, and that's where you have the what we typically call SJWs. I wish that we had a better word for that, because I think that being for social justice is a great thing, but these are people who are completely against any kind of hierarchy of ideas. They're against any kind of logic or reason or science or anything that has to do with trying to make sense of the world around you, and instead of just relying on your feelings. And so you have those two extremities, where you either become like an animal or you become like a machine. And so if you can, I think that's when I think that even people who may be in the middle, they may end up where they're kind of split into two, where they could have been given the best of both worlds, I think that sometimes they end up with just the worst of both worlds, where they're both a binary thinker with oversimplifying tremendous number of things, and at the same time just holding these irrational, completely, paradoxical ideas in their head and flailing about with that. And so it's like I think that that there's always what do you see there being a trade? I don't see it as like a slider. I don't think you necessarily are all the way to one end or all the way to the other. I think that you can have a kind of a, I don't know how to describe it other than visually, but where you can end up sliding out towards the ends, or maybe there was two sliders, both of them coming inward or both of them going outward. So I don't know if that makes sense.
So I have a question for both of you guys. It's a little bit unrelated to what you were just talking about, but something that's been sort of on my mind lately. I kind of think of the difference between someone who is transgender, and then you have all these other labels such as agender, gender fluid, what are the other ones? I guess non-binary, all of these sort of like nuanced gender identities. Are any of those actually observable scientifically, neurologically whatsoever, or is it just sort of just arbitrary labels?
Well, that's where I think as much as it is true that, as we're saying, there is a slider, it's not just male or female, and, we have come quite a way in accepting gayness and trans and all that since, let's say, the 50s or Shakespearean era, or who knows. So I will give, my respect to some LGBTQ activists, of course. It is a valid human rights thing. Like I was saying on Twitter just earlier, and what goes to our early conversation, I am all for social justice. I think men's rights fall squarely under the social justice banner, umbrella situation. The cry bullies, the people that are radical feminists most often, who are known as SJWs, they're social injustice warriors. They're all about excluding as many people as possible and making things privileged for one tiny little group. They're doing the opposite of what they're preaching. It's nothing but projection. And I do think there's a subset that does create genders and identities by just splitting hairs into that slider, that scale that we're talking about, instead of just saying, right, okay, there's male, female, then there's gay for both of those, lesbian, homosexual, or whatever it is for guys, I guess, gay. It's always weirded me out that we have the word lesbian, but we don't have homosexual still means same sex, so that applies to women and men. And then gay just means homosexual, so that applies to both men and women. But yet lesbian is exclusive to women, and men that are gay don't have their own.
It's misandry.
It is misandry, I'm telling you. But I mean, no, it is. Things are skewed towards the female gender. I mean, they're the ones trying to dictate the rules and why. Twitter headquarters and MSNBC and Law and Order SVU and whoever's making Zoe Quinn's movie, all of them are looking at the skewed pro-female perspective to the exclusion of men, quite literally in some of those cases. Specifically, some of those people have become famous or received harassment that made them famous because they were abusing men and being cruel to them. But somehow it's society that is cruel to women because we let these women that abuse men succeed. That makes sense. Anyway, the kind of digresses, but I do believe there are, of course, toxic elements, and a lot of them do happen to find themselves in the feminist academia, LGBTQTIIS plus. I don't know what is happening there.
I think we gotta get everybody using one that's the letters that they've already found, like the PQTQ whatever plus, and then add a bunch more and just keep adding, and I think we need to get a whole community of people just trolling that by adding more fucking letters and because then everybody will be like, oh, that must be the new letters. I didn't know that those were the new letters. I gotta add that on now too, and just do it. Just try to add just two. I think we need to add 2 more letters to whatever that one is and start just putting that out there, and then as people start using that, add some more letters, and just pretty soon it'll be 3 paragraphs long. It'll be great.
They would do it. I mean, they're so obsessed with inclusiveness. You could probably just tell anyone, just message them and be like, hey, did you know there's a new letter added? And that it would just start a chain reaction.
We just got to start doing it as hashtags, or in response to things, and just go ahead, and just secretly just kind of put that out there, and just kind of keep adding letters.
I refuse to use all the letters. I'm just gonna from now on just be like the fairies, and that includes everyone, just all the fairies.
All the fairies. I think that handles it though. I think that's very inclusive. I mean, I don't think you should
It's
be against
cuter too.
fairies. Yeah, yeah. I think it's against fairies. It's anti-fairyist to not allow that to be one word that includes everyone.
The funny part of that inclusivity, as you mentioned, is that they will continue split this toxic subsection of that they do congregate, frequently on places like Tumblr, the dark corners of Tumblr, or sometimes on Twitter. But there are, and of course, in real life, there's like feminist workshops and bookshops where they like use fisting a lot. Apparently, I don't know why that's been like a big queer lesbian sex thing. But anyway, there is not that I think there's anything wrong with that. And apparently it is actually illegal to sell videos with fisting in them, which I find utterly bizarre, and I would be all for repealing that law. But that doesn't mean I have to be doing that, to show my support or consider myself a feminist, porn maker, which I've also found that is frequently kind of a requirement nowadays. Whenever you're especially speaking out against the demonization of the porn industry, you kind of have to say, I'm a feminist, and then you say that you're a porn star. Otherwise, people treat you like your voice doesn't really matter. But if you're like somehow a feminist and still do porn, but then it's legitimate. So
But otherwise, you're dogpiled. That's it. It's like you're not a dogpile immediately. And the funny thing is, it's uh, in general, I tend to have liberal views. But then, then I start watching these things where they have the feminist stuff. It's like, oh, you're making us look so stupid. Please stop. It's just craziness. It's like the hateful misandry where they're just going, and then the people who like have to give their hats off to that. It's like, no, I swear I'm a good liberal. I swear, no, really I am. I see. I support absolutely everything every crazy hyper feminist thing that anybody ever said. I support all of it. It's like, oh God. Oh my God, really? Do you have to?
So oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, just to kind of, I guess, repeat myself, just like, is there legitimacy to sort of like agenderism? I don't know if that's completely a
Oh,
word,
someone
or
not being
like,
agender? Yeah, I mean, what they're kind of showing that along with all of these different scanning, there's everything from the scanning to the, genetic markers, et cetera, that change the brain areas. But, from what I understand, I don't have a study here that I can cite immediately, unfortunately, but I'm pretty sure I remember there being studies that showed that, different subjects do have those gender dimorphisms at varying levels by the brain area. So in other words, there is a complexity there where you may be more feminized in one brain area and more masculine in another brain area, and so you could have your own mixture. Now those are, once again, we're talking about, yeah, I don't know what percentage is the norm. I mean, perhaps it's not a very strong rule, and the rule is 70% of people are conform primarily to the gender binary, and then the other 30% are all, kind of spotty somewhere in the middle. But I think that there's certainly going to be people who cross over, to the male side in one, set of behaviors and ways in which they use their brain, and cross over to the female side, and then there's somebody who's just dead center of all of it too. So I mean, I would say that there definitely has to be some exceptions that hit all of those points, based upon all the science that I've seen. But I mean, once again, there is the general populace, and the normal general populace, and maybe that's only like 70, maybe it's 60%. I don't know. But there is a large percentage of people who conform to a gender binary, and then there is a percentage of people who are all just scattered in between, and even just by a specific brain area.
right. I certainly would never contest that there are people who feel not necessarily hyper feminine or hyper masculine, and they may find themselves somewhere in between. But I guess my issue I take with that is the people that then take on, a label of non-binary, agender. It's like, to me, I've never met, and I've met a lot of people who identify this way, and to Me, I've never met a single person who would call themselves agender, non-binary, fluid, any of those things, who are not heavily involved in feminist activism or progressive activism. So to me, it's definitely came across as a political tactic. I don't think I've ever met a person who identifies as any of those things who isn't very vocal.
Unfortunately, it is just really within the group that considers themselves liberal. You're kicked out if you don't identify with the bullshit politic. That is feminism. I mean, that's the rule. That's the one thing. I think that literally there is less individuality allowed among the liberal population than there is among the more conservative population, and so there is, you've really got to stick to that party line, or you're kicked out. You're not one of us. That kind of thing. And so I think that perhaps what you find is that perhaps the people who are more liberal, they are conforming more to the that's the whole. They take the baby and the bathwater, and they're never going to separate them. It's like both the baby and the bathwater. I have to have all of it, and and that's. I think that may be what's going on there. But Cherry has something.
Yeah, I think as I was saying, while we can recognize legitimacy of LGBTQT, and that's where I'll forever end it. Um, there's legitimacy in that advocacy for human rights and the gay marriage and all that good stuff. But there is a subsection of academics and Tumblrites and 3.0 feminists who continue dividing the genders and them slicing into thinner and thinner, splitting hairs basically, and creating extra letters and identities. And they are basically, gender is a social construct to them. They are creating shit out of thin air in a certain way. And it's reductive, it's masturbatory, frankly, and it doesn't really accomplish anything. Probably gives them grant money or, teaching and speaking fees and all that. So there's that side of it where I feel like it does lose legitimacy. Yes, there's a spectrum, but you don't need to name every single freaking degree. And,
Exactly.
but on the other hand, not but really, but shoot, I just had it a second ago. Oh, there we go. No, the question is, what about agender in sense of like asexual in that regard? There is a lack of testosterone, lack of hormones that can lead to a person feeling genuinely without a sex drive. Different balances, as even Blair has experienced herself, just changing hormone levels and inputs has changed sex drive, and that's something that is consistent across. In fact, women have perhaps a very interesting even relationship between like the female hormones and orgasm, because for instance women need to have a completely relaxed brain waves that have to be happy alpha waves in order to be able to orgasm, physically be able to orgasm, which men don't really necessarily have that issue. But so there's different ways in which testosterone versus estrogen affect the brain and different brain areas and how the body reacts to things. So you can have somebody with super low testosterone and therefore not have any sex drive at all whatsoever, or they could have a mix that makes them feel asexual, or frequently with depression and changes in serotonin and dopamine. And we can talk about those neurotransmitters and relationships between oxytocin and dopamine, serotonin, and all that. That has to do with hormones, because hormones are massive regulators of not just brain areas. They're also in the body. It's different sexual characteristics grow in the womb depending on which hormone is present. They have powerful effects over our physical bodies. So there are ways in which a person could be asexual. I haven't looked into it to find out what is the research on asexuality. From what I understand, it's kind of a murky topic as it is. There's not that much research happening around it. I would like to believe that some people do feel a overwhelming lack of sexual drive, but once again, I could tie that with a depressive state or hormone imbalance. But I want to know what you might think about that, Richard, or Blair, either way.
I wish I'd been listening closer.
Okay, well, I can say, well, there's asexuality, which I find a lot easier to view as legitimate, and then there's agender, which to me, when someone says they're agender, it seems as though they're conflating gender expression with gender itself and gender identity itself. I feel like if you're agender, a lot of these people tend to dress in a gender neutral way. They may have certain aspects to their aesthetic that are feminine, certain aspects that are masculine. And to me, that's purely a performance thing. That's purely an aesthetic thing. But then that goes to, if gender is a social construct, then that really does reduce every single person to a performer of sorts, right?
Yeah, I think that everybody, everybody has to kind of perform. It's like I forget what it is in Japanese, but they have this like your inner face and your outer face, and everybody kind of has to have a little bit of performance to the public in general. But I think there's also the poser thing where you typically have more posers than you have authentics, and they're usually copying somebody who's authentic, and so you have I think that maybe there are people who are genuinely like right there dead in the middle. And I think that there's a lot more people who are posing as that and are actually doing it more for attention. And I think that's kind of a norm. I mean, just like during the hippie revolution, it's like most of them would not actually conform to all of the different ideals that had to do with basically giving up privilege and and those sort of things. Whereas people, they just wanted to go out and party, and that was the next way to the next bandwagon to jump on. And so I think that you've got perhaps what you have is bad bandwagoneers that you're seeing way more of, and they seem to be the rule instead of, and it's unfortunate because what you have is that there are a lot of people who are genuinely something, and then they end up looking like, because the rule of those people who appear like that, since they start being copied, the rule ends up being some inauthentic crap that you end up tending to see the people who actually were authentic on that same light. So I think that may be what's going on there.
I think that's been a huge issue with just noticing a lot of the online reaction to really anything related to transgenderism these days. It seems to be a huge conflation of all of these sort of, and again, in my opinion, I think that neurologically, obviously, gender is a spectrum, but I think that as far as all these arbitrary labels, I do see them largely as arbitrary. A lot of people tend to conflate these very out there random identities with trans identity, and I feel like in some ways it definitely harms trans people. Not to say that trans people are just so much more authentic than someone who would say that they're non-binary or whatever, but do you see where I'm kind of going with that?
Yeah, it's just basically there's going to be people who are bandwagoning because if it's a hot button issue, or if it's popular, if it's going to get them some sort of attention or whatever, they're gonna do that. And so yeah, there's always going to be it doesn't matter what it is, like whether it be any kind of social system that is set up to help people is invariably polluted by those who wish to exploit it, and that happens with every social system. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't set up positive social systems to make things work better, but it just means that there's always going to be those who are going to try to exploit it for something, and that's basically what your bandwagoning, your attention whoring type of people typically are doing. They want, it's like whatever it is that's popular, whatever it is that's going to get me attention, and of course it always hurts those who are that genuine thing. And so yeah, and it's so difficult to tell the difference. I mean, how are you going to tell the difference when some people who it's not wrong to want attention. All of us want attention. Every that's just kind of a human thing. But at the same time, it's just what I guess what lengths you're willing to go to, and how inauthentic you're willing to be, and how much you're willing to not care how your bullshit is impacting other human beings. That kind of comes through in those people who are just willing to jump on any bandwagon, pretend anything, false accusations. Like for instance, the best example is false accusations of rape. That hurts people who have been genuinely raped tremendously. And so it's, of course, I think that you're always going to have these huge groups of shitty people who will going to jump on and get what they can, because I don't think it's because I don't think they even know what they're doing. I don't think they ever it bounces off their brain that what they're doing is going to hurt the people who genuinely need to be seen, or need to be heard, or need to be understood. And so I don't think it's malicious. I just think it's just negligent stupidity. They just don't realize what they're doing, and they're just going after that next cookie. Whatever makes them feel good for a second.
Yeah, I don't think it's what we tend to call them, at least in the trans community, we call them trans trenders.
Oh, wow. Well said.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's exactly it.
yeah.
Well, sadly, I've received news. That's what you guys were hearing in the middle of Richard talking, the random noises. Steve, sad news. Brian will not be able to join us today after all, given that there's about
Aw.
7 minutes left on the show. Yeah, but he says hi, Blair, so there's that. But his
Hi,
ISP,
Brian.
his ISP is being a pain, and I'd be willing to bet it is Comcast. But anyway, if we have any more information over, I'm pretty sure we covered all the sexual demographic areas we wanted to cover, and how sometimes social defeat or other external factors, fetal hormones in the womb and variety of other things that affect sexuality and gender, and how that ties in with autism and all that good stuff. And citations will be available in the low bar, so you guys can see the show notes with a lot of the detailed science and links to the studies. Now, if there's anything more we wanted to add about, gender, it being a social construct or not, poor David Reamer, who, on whom this whole thing is based, or if any parting words, if either of you want to say before we sign off for today's show.
I would like to invite anyone to explore the idea that, the very last link I have here is the autism theory and sexual dimorphism is the name of the paper, I believe. Or maybe it's the amygdala and the relevance detection theory of autism. Yeah, that's it. An evolutionary perspective. I think basically what they're getting at there is something akin to my own personal. When I found this, I didn't realize that anybody else had started to come to the same kind of theoretical perspective on sexual dimorphism, and the tools based versus the social based brain, and how that interacts with autism. But if you find that an interesting subject, I'd love to chit chat about it. I mean, it is basically speculation, but there is a tremendous amount of science that we have kind of talked about here that seems to point in that direction, and so I think it's an interesting thing. But other than that, I think that's all I wanted to talk about today.
What about you, Blair?
Uh, I am sorry that I couldn't happily contribute to this. I feel like you guys were so much more prepared than I was, but I found a lot of it really interesting, and I feel like I learned a lot, so that's good.
Well, thank you very much. You were able to give insight from a perspective that that we can't give, so that's extremely valuable. You contributed what needed to be contributed.
Oh, no, I was
Thank
actually
you.
quite impressed with your ability to, bring out certain facts for how little you said you knew. I mean, there certainly is a good base of knowledge that, you had. And I really like a lot of your observation points. And of course, the personal experience is what kind of, humanizes all this cold, research that a lot of times the liberals or postmodernists in particular, are so afraid of.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much for being our guest, and thank you to our watchers and listeners who joined in and stuck around with us through all the fast facts. And as I mentioned like 10 times, there will definitely be citations and show notes. And if you guys enjoy this type of show and want to contribute to it, of course, Feed the Badger, the Honey Badger Radio Patreon situation, and that is patreon.com/honeybadgerradio, I believe. And of course, there's an option for my Patreon as well, which is patreon.com/AnnaCherry, that allows you to join us for more conversation and kind of shooting the shit for a little while after the shows are over. So you can join the Badgerkin reward and be in on these after shows. Now, if Blair would like to also, mention what kind of where you can be found on YouTube, Twitter, or what kind of projects you have coming up, if anything like that you want to show.
Okay. Yeah, you can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/BlairWhiteX. There's an E at the end of Blair. Everyone spells it wrong. And it's 1X, not 3. I don't do porn. And you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/Ms. Blair White. That's MS Blair White.
Cool. Cherry asked me a question here. The one thing I do want to mention is I'm going to have something coming up where I'm doing a web series on basically the attack of postmodernism upon the whole of the academic science community, and how it is starting to weasel its way into the basis of our a collection of knowledge and eat away at the core of science in academia. And I'm going to be doing a web series on that. Whenever I get the first video done, we had some problems, some technical difficulties with the first introduction video, but I hope you'll check that out. And whenever I get that done, we'll probably mention it by the next time we do a show.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and definitely leave your comments if you want to discuss some of these topics that we covered in particular in more detail, or ask for more resources, and join the conversation below. And thank you once again for sticking around, and have a good night.